So in order to understand how the prefrontal cortex works, you have to hear the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railway foreman in the 1850s, and he was laying those really big rods of nails through the ground, and it was like 26 inches long, really thick, and a piece of dynamite went off, like they normally do, and it caused one of these rods to go through his skull. He didn't die. He actually survived the injury, but it went through sort of this way and out, sort of the front portion of his skull. And in doing so, it took out his prefrontal cortex. But he survived. He came out of it without any serious impairments as far as strength, mobility, even concentration ability, speech ability. It was all intact afterwards. He didn't work as a foreman anymore, but the story that I read wasn't because he was limited in his ability to work. He just chose to change jobs. He became a little bit more difficult to work with. He actually had to move countries at some point and picked up a new job somewhere else. And doctor's notes from the new country suggest that he was a pretty normal human being. So no one really knew at that point, if they had never known him before, that he had had this catastrophic brain injury that apparently left him kind of the same. So what did it change about him? Well, it's important to understand the two things about the brain that we're going to talk about. Number one is when you talk about the brain, there's sort of like this evolutionary development of the brain that you can reference. So if I show you the brain sideways, we're looking at let's move my mic so you don't get confused. We're looking back here at the cerebellum, which controls a lot of our movements that we don't have to think about, learning how to ride a bicycle, things like that. A lot of just things that we take for granted. Torso balance, coordination, ataxia, some fine movements of our fingers that we don't think about. As we move up, we get into the occipital lobe that has a lot of information about vision, but it has a lot of information processing in there too. It's the very first portion of our brain that myelinates when we're children, when we're babies. So then we move forward to the parietal lobe, and in the parietal lobe we have our sensory information. We have on the side here the temporal lobe where we have our speech centers. And then the next step forward when we get to the frontal cortex is the motor strip. So that's the final thing before you get into the prefrontal lobe. So it's sort of like this evolutionarily advancement process. We call the cerebellum the old brain. A lot of movement information is there, but it's not a lot of that conscious processing movement information. The final step here in the frontal cortex of the motor strip is where you process a lot of the your final your motor decision. So if you're trying to make a decision about moving this microphone, for example, that process is right here in the frontal cortex right before it gets sent out to your hands or to your mouth to make any kind of movement, for instance. Once we pass that, information gets a lot more vague. So once we get sort of here to the prefrontal lobe, we don't have as obvious of a map, if you will, a cortical map of what things do. So things get a lot more vague up there. So the idea is, if you look at Phineas Gage's story, you can survive without a prefrontal cortex. All of your basic human functions are intact inside the rest of your brain. So what does the prefrontal cortex do if you don't need it to survive? If you can hold down a job without a prefrontal cortex, what's the point? So I got this idea. The way that this idea got turned into words for me was watching an interview between Huberman and Jordan Peterson, where Huberman is a neuroscientist and Jordan Peterson is a psychologist from Canada. And I think Peterson is the one who put it into the best words. He says basically the prefrontal cortex plans out versions of yourself for the rest of the brain to enact, plans out versions of yourself and decides the best version of you that's going to be successful. So it's basically a flexible rule-setting structure for the rest of your brain. The rest of your brain is implanted, is decided on what it's supposed to do. The frontal cortex or the motor strip's job is to do movement. The sensory strip's job is to feel sensation. The occipital lobe's job is to see things. That stuff is set in stone. But the prefrontal cortex is constantly kind of establishing rules for how everything is supposed to operate. The creating personalities and versions of yourself that make the most sense. And so somewhere along the way, the prefrontal cortex has to make decisions for you, such as you're facing a threat. Do you retreat? Do you stay in the same place? Do you move forward and face the threat? This could be literally in a fight. This could be something as simple as a conversation. Do you become the converser where you have the conversation? It's still motor movements, right? Speech is still motor. Do you become the person that speaks? Do you become the person that backs off? Or do you become the person that does nothing and just sort of watches and waits? So these abstract potentials of ourself that the prefrontal cortex is creating lets us plan out versions of ourselves that we're going to want to keep or we want to discard. So going back to Phineas Gage, what ends up happening in the story is that he becomes a very difficult guy to work with. He's no longer the same Phineas Gage that everybody knew from beforehand. He's a little bit more short, meaning he gets angry faster probably, and the story goes that even though he was pretty normal and functional, his personality had changed completely. And I suspect his personality became a lot more inflexible. He became a lot less capable of changing his personality for the circumstances that he had to face, which is frankly a pretty complicated ability to have, and he didn't have that anymore, I suspect. Okay, I think that's enough for now.